And so for this morning, we're going to kick off with a talk thinking about propagation. So yesterday we talked about what is forest farming, some of the different species that can grow in a forest farm and other considerations. But how can we make sure that we're being good stewards of these plants and continuing to grow propagation, continuing to grow their populations through propagation? So, this morning to start off, I would like to welcome Badger Johnson. Badger is a consulting forester and founder/owner of Paradise Ecological Services. He brings a diverse background in forest management, fire ecology, and forest farming to land management and natural resources education. Badger teaches several agroecology courses at Prescott College and helps coordinate training for safe prescribed fire practices. His master's research at the University of Missouri-Columbia explored different site factors such as forest stand density and canopy gaps for establishing different botanicals in a forest farm setting. Today, Badger will talk about various propagation techniques to support the establishment of different forest botanicals in a forest farm. So let's welcome Badger. And that's the clicker.
Thank you, Raylan. Yeah. Well, good morning, folks. I'll try and keep this fresh. There's so many people with so much knowledge and experience. And today we're going to be talking about, how do you propagate these herbs? How do you get started and work with the propagules to establish a successful commercial forest farming venture? So, quick outline. Talk about the overall strategy of planting test plots first. Talk a little bit about plugs, and then seeds, which are definitely a horse of a different color. And then if we have time, we'll touch on some aspects of site prep and site selection, but I think that is pretty well covered by other speakers in this itinerary. These herbs that people grow for non-timber forest product sales, they're a diverse set of organisms. Each crop is different, and whether you're dividing rhizomes or planting seeds, there's a ton of different choices. So anything I say, I'm trying to keep it general, but give lots of specific examples. You're going to have to run through and take your knowledge deeper with any crop that you want to commit to growing at any kind of scale. So I'm going to give credit where credit's due. Andrea Miller at Rural Action Inc. in Ohio. What she suggests, I think, is an excellent strategy, which is put test patches on the different sites that you are considering on your farm. So even a 2-acre woodlot is going to have often a number of choices that you could make. And unless you're going to plant the whole 2 acres all at once, which I don't think I really recommend, send up a trial balloon, So in a scenario where I live, a woodlot is going to have some steeply dissected topography, assuming the soil's not too saturated to plant these herbs in. And so say you own a holler or part of a holler. There's a flat ridge on top. There's a back slope somewhere mid-slope. There's a shelf that might be good for soil moisture. There's a toe slope. This is an area of soil accumulation. All seem like they might be good sites in this case. So let's say you decide to plant 4 test patches, one on each one of these site types. And you could just do that with 10 plugs or, 10 rooted cuttings, let's say of golden seal. You can monitor how they do and how they respond to growing conditions as they are for a couple of years. And something I want to hammer home is during that time, if you're just beginning to bring your woodlot under management, that is a great time to get the invasive species under control. these little forest fragments often have a lot of the edge effect, and bush honeysuckle and other things like that. Uh, it takes a few years to get them under control, especially if you're doing it organically. Um, uh, you might do a little prescribed fire during that time to reduce leaf litter, um, which can be advantageous for good seed germination and seed to soil contact and to reduce brush. And then, you see which one of these did the best, these test patches, and then maybe you can expand from there. Um, Maybe they all do really well, and maybe none of the test patches do well, and all of this is maybe you'd be unhappy if none of them did well, but still very useful information, and you can decide what more specific um, sort of site preparation might be needed before scaling up if you are not getting good growth on these test patches. Here's an example. This is one of NRCS's many beautiful little landscape maps. And so when I talk about different sort of site types, you see that, somewhere you could plant a little patch of 10 golden seal. Somewhere on this back slope, you could plant another little patch where the angle of the slope is less. Conditions will probably be different. And then on this toe slope, let's see. So just a few quotes from the internet. Your plan ultimately, your first version of the plan is probably going to be pretty useless, but the labor and the thinking and the strategizing and the reading you did is going to be essential later. And by having multiple test patches, you kind of hedge your bets. So I want to acknowledge that Janine Davis is co-author on sort of the Bible of propagating these plants. So any errors or any points of disagreement, listen to Janine, not me. But yeah, so how do you produce like plugs or root divisions? You want to get your potting medium, light and fluffy, and have good microbial communities. There's a lot of different potting mixes you could use. Some ones that I hear people consistently talk about will have some sand, some leaf mold. There might be a mixture of, compost activated biochar, a little bit of topsoil from the stand to inoculate whatever microbes are going to be present. Make sure it's not too heavy. So when you transplant it, the fine roots aren't broken. It's very easy to make your own plugs. If you've got a national forest nearby, you can get a permit to dig up some roots or some rhizomes. A rhizome is like a horizontal underground root. Make sure when you're dividing these things that you get at least one good bud to form a new stem and as many of the fine roots as you can. And I'll go back a couple of slides here. You can see on this golden seal rhizome, there's a bud, there's a bud, there's a bud, there's a bud. There's probably a bud somewhere down on here. And so this nice big golden seal root, if you dug it up and want to start some test patches, if you divide it, you don't have to dig up too many of those to do a little trial like this. I would say the simplest thing would probably be to plant plugs when they're dormant. And you want moist soil when you put them in the ground, and whether that's because it has been raining or it's about to rain, or you watered the plugs in really well when you planted them, you want there to be instant connection to moisture for that fine root system. So there's just try to get enough pictures in here to keep visual interest. When I say a plug, here's what I mean, just a little potted plant. Somebody divided up a black cohosh rhizome. Here's John Munsell, who may or may not be watching. Jim Chamberlain, and you can see they're all thinking about Janine's Bible of forest farming up here, while they're looking down at a propagation bed, which these are false unicorn roots or fairy wand that they're going to divide out and plant test plots with probably. Um, so why and when would you do this? We talked about that a little bit. But if you plant on the same good day for planting, maybe 10 to 30 plugs at each test patch, um, uh, to control for, oh, I picked the wrong day to plant these things, then you'll get a good sense after a couple of years. Ideally, these test patches will be producing seed for you soon, and so the first seeds that you plant might be seeds from your initial plugs that you put in. And uh, yeah, if the individuals in the test patch are growing well and making seed, that's the plant telling you that it's happy and it's ready. The site is ready to put some more plants in. If they're not happy, something needs to change, or maybe you have to say, this is really not the site to focus on. So here's a flat of a bunch of bloodroot starts under shade cloth. Um, some of these could take full sun, but oftentimes seedlings or new plants are a little bit more fragile, and so having them under artificial shade or under a shady canopy at the edge of your yard or something like that can be good. And it doesn't have to be big scale commercial like that. Just for starting test plots, you could have divide up some rhizomes and do it on a much more home scale just for starters. And then when should you plant seed? And well, you should plant seed when you know you've got a site where those seedlings are going to germinate, survive, do well. So, and you probably want to do it after you control the invasives. Every species here can be a little different in terms of the conditions it wants, and that includes at the seed and seedling stage. So, a lot of people will, for ginseng or bloodroot, they will plant seed that they've already stratified and prepared. Stratification has to do with like the temperature requirements that a seed has to go through in order to exit dormancy, because the seed knows that it doesn't want to start growing in the middle of the winter or the middle of the summer. Often they want to grow when there's going to be plenty of soil moisture sometime in the spring. But ramps would like to be planted while it's still a little bit warm, and then it gets cold and warm again. Whereas ginseng, you could plant in the spring after a period of cold stratification without that warm period first. So just, read up, read your Bible. And another thing, people talk about microbes and soil mycorrhizae and stuff. There's a lot we don't know, but we do know that unless you're talking about mustard or kale or something, there's usually some kind of mycorrhizal symbionts that a plant is going to want. And so incorporating a little bit of leaf mold from the site into your potting mix can be helpful with the plugs. But I'll just point out, people have the hardest time growing lady slippers, and that's something that they're rare, they're beautiful. I've read that they have narcotic properties. I don't know why people want the roots exactly, but orchids need, like the seeds need a hyphae of, the underground part of a mushroom to like crack into the seed, and then it parasitizes the mycorrhizae. So like that's sort of an extreme example of needing the microbial community to be kind of dialed in. Moisture, all of these seeds need sufficient and consistent moisture to germinate and get established. Um, and then there's the soil contact issue. I'm sure if you've ever grown vegetables, annual vegetables, you know that planting depth matters, and it's often dictated by the seed size, right? So, like black cohosh seed, it's tiny, and it's not that hard to start from seed. You can broadcast it, um, but if you worked it down 2 inches in the soil, you probably would not get a bunch of the black cohosh coming up. Um, at least I wouldn't bet the farm on it. Ginseng seeds are larger. They're like a beet seed, so they have a little bit of soil on top of them. That's probably good. Keep them from drying out. Um, and then there's, people differ in their opinions, like any technical issue in agroforestry. Coming from the chestnut world, people are arguing about seedling trees versus grafted trees, round and round. Um, People have opinions in forest farming about whether you should just rake and scatter, um, or if you should singulate the seed and put it exactly where you want. I think that comes down to how expensive and abundant is the seed, how much is your time worth. If you make $50 an hour doing something else, maybe buying more seed and spending less time and having a lower germination rate is perfectly acceptable. But like doing the math, if your time's not that valuable uh, at work, um, it might actually make sense to uh, get a ginseng planter like they do it in Wisconsin, and plant each individual ginseng seed where you want it, and not have it, if you have really good germination and a rake and scatter, you might have to thin out plants that were expensive to put in. And if you spread it out a little bit more, I'm not saying spread it out a ton and make it look like there's just a few scattered individuals, because that's not the intensive eye in agroforestry, right? You could, if you do this method, which I favor more and more for ginseng, you could come back and plant golden seal between all the ginseng seeds, which is like a very common thing to reduce disease pressure in cultivated ginseng, um, and for black cohosh for that matter. I just talked about that. But when you think about it, it's like, okay, if I individually plant seeds at the spacing I want, with $100 tool or $50 in parts if you build your own, um, maybe you'll plant 5 pounds of ginseng seed an acre, and for $100 a pound, that's $500 an acre or something. If you rake and scatter and you plant 3 times more seed, well, that's $1,500 an acre of establishment cost that goes into your enterprise budget. Um, I think a lot of people tend to plant less ginseng because the seed is more expensive. And it's like, well, if you spread it out, I don't know. I have an opinion on that, but I've also done plenty of rake and scatter ginseng. So, and it works great. So, um, here's another example. I was just out harvesting Pedicularis canadensis seed. It's an interesting one that people and tribes around the Great Lakes region are fond of. And the seed also sells for something like $400 a pound. So um, it turns out it does very well with, scattering on soil in the fall after a fall prescribed fire. But I think most of it gets planted by a seed drill in pollinator planting mixes. So it's not just jab planters. If you want to, individually plant seed exactly where you want it, in some instances, a no-till seed drill can be useful for these high-value, slow-growing perennial herbs. Oh, right. Okay, so we're through kind of the propagation thing. I want to stop and just invite interaction with the other people in this room. Um, Has anybody done? Does anybody have an opinion or something to add about like uh, when to plant plugs, when to plant seed, how to plant those things, and you just share your experience with it? Don't be shy. There might be a question from the online people if there's people in the online room too. We got a question in the back here.
Specifically, talking about seeds and plugs for ramps, when did you, can you repeat again when you plant seed for ramps? And then also, I'm curious on the timing of when you would do the plugs. Like, yeah, thank you.
Right. So weather and climate, it's variable. It's always changing. So when you harvest the seeds is when they're ready, and that's just dictated by the phenology of the plant. My experience and talking to other people who grow ramp from seed is they harvest it. It's usually where I am ready in September or October, and then you just basically plant it immediately. And so like the rake and scatter method. And I want to give a shout out to all the people who have planted ramps in the past who've had their patches just like disappear into some fancy restaurant in New York City from Appalachian, Ohio, because that happens. And so if you have a mature ramp patch that you're tending, every year it produces a lot of seed. And basically you can harvest all that seed and start another patch that's 5 times bigger than the one you're harvesting from if you have the patience and time. And if somebody comes and digs up your first patch, that's okay. If you do that every year, you have, 7 patches somewhere, scattered across your properties or the national forest or some land that you're leasing. And yeah, if they hit one, you've got a bunch coming up. So if you can solve the land access problem, especially in a woodlot that might have like a grazing history and there's just like no native herbs currently growing, you're going to be adding native biodiversity by planting these things. So, I wouldn't go to somewhere where there's a bunch of, mad dog skullcap or pedicularis or beach drops, things that are indicators of like undisturbed, relatively pristine habitat. But if you go into like a degraded woodland and you're planting a bunch of these things, you're making the site better, especially if you're removing the invasives. So, Janine.
Just made the comment with the ramps that they're putting on seed every year. Do you see that around here that you get annual seed production?
I wouldn't say from each plant, but like within a well-established patch. Yeah, that's been my experience.
Okay, yeah, because we often will see, go a year or two with no seeds, basically. So, yeah, that's interesting. Thank you.
Good to know.
Yeah, so for the ramp seed piece, I can attest locally that we're getting different amount, like some years there's a lot of seed and some years there's less, but every year there's seed. So that's interesting. And then with ramp seed and really with others that I've had experience with, I feel like because these are really slow growing plants, it's just important to remember to have faith in the seed and also like plant more seed than you want. I don't know, maybe others who are more experienced with this have more reliable techniques, but like with the ramp seed that we've been planting for years, I feel like just in the last year or two, we're starting to see a lot of those seeds finally coming up, being visible to us anyway, which is really, it's like, okay, it's working. But just like, and we've lost a lot of, we planted a lot of seed and then it's like, okay, well, it came up and now it's gone. And, that could be predation or whatever the reason. just to keep that in mind, that these are slow growing perennial plants. So faith in the magic.
Yeah, I like to
Seed.
think, you only have to buy seed and plant it once, then you can harvest a bunch of seed and expand your patch from there. Like once you get to a certain scale, um, and you don't have to spend a ton of time like cleaning the seed. It doesn't have to look as nice as when you bought a packet from somebody. If you crush whatever little brown paper wrapping the seed is in, uh, scatter, the seeds don't mind being planted with the desiccated flour. Uh, just a couple hours every year could pay off big time over the long haul. Okay, so soil amendments. I think doing a soil test on any site that you're going to expand on is really good. People frequently might apply some lime. I might have recommended to Lindy at Ozark Mountain Ginseng to put a little dolomitic lime on the ginseng we saw in the video yesterday. Leaf compost, biochar. These are all things that people do, and sometimes if it's a slow growing root and it's really small, doing a little bit more intensive stuff, bed cultivation or whatever, and making the soil light and easy to penetrate, those roots can bulk up, and if something as small as a false unicorn root is larger and you get paid by the pound, and it's not all about the Chinese version of the doctrine of signatures with ginseng, then bigger is better. Yeah. So you can see here's a nice big patch of Actea racemosa, black cohosh, and you can see it's very happy where it is, and thinning out maybe some of the shrubs from that patch, letting a little more light in, and burning. This is one of these plants that does really well with some regular dormancies and fire. And the burning will thin some of the mid-story usually. So it doesn't all have to be done with a chainsaw or goats or whatever, but I think fire is the answer to everything. So take what I say with a grain of salt. So just more details at the end, but you have to think about forest soils. If you look at a soil map, it'll be like, this is a complex of these two soil types, and over here it's a complex of two other soil types. What that means in practice, and the soil maps are very rarely accurate at the stand level. It's just a prediction of what's there by soil scientists. But a complex is, 70% of the surface of that soil is one type of, looks one way, and you get to the 30%, which can be spread out in little patches and weird ways that are hard for the layperson to predict. You could have sandy loam on part of it, and you could have hard red clay on part of it. And herbs will grow in both, but guess which one they'll grow faster in, assuming there's adequate moisture. The one where their roots can expand rapidly. So I've dug soil pits in fields for chestnuts before and realized, oh, I dug in one of the two soil types in the complex that is this field, and I did not get granular enough data. And the chestnut performance across that field is variable as a result. So if you're buying a bunch of seed, make sure it goes in the soil type that it's going to do well in. And then who's that fella from Penn State? Gosh, Eric Burkhart. Yeah, I think he had a paper showing that ginseng grows better and faster, all other things being equal, with 3,000 pounds of calcium an acre versus 2,000. And so it's just something to bear in mind. Lime is pretty cheap and it's natural. It's abundant. So if you're worried about The pH of your soil, if it's too high or too low. You could add gypsum if you don't want to raise the pH. You could add just regular lime if you want more calcium but don't need any more magnesium. You can add dolomitic limestone if you want to raise the magnesium as well as the calcium. And that's organic farmers are very into this like soil nutrient balancing thing. And if you have too much magnesium and not enough calcium, if the ratio is off, the soil is like a little bit denser than it needs to be. And so that's something that a soil test can tell you. Shade, there's a Goldilocks zone, too much, too little. The amount of shade, the amount of light for each of these species can be a little bit different. And yeah, some of these things will grow out in the open if you control competition, just full light. If you tried that with golden seal, it would not be so happy. So again, if you're in doubt about how much light your crop species wants, I would say don't restrict your readings to the agroforestry world. Go read a monograph on the plant by a botanist or an ecologist who only knows this plant as a wild plant, and they will tell you how much light that thing needs, because the agroforestry world is not new, but we're sort of newly coming together. And sometimes we pass on inherited knowledge that is maybe broadly accurate, but not very precise. And so you don't want to bet the farm on a just so story that got written down somewhere and repeated, but might not be that true. I will say one other thing about site selection. Site indicator tree and herb, shrub species, it's useful, but just because a plant is absent from a site or a natural community is absent from a site, that doesn't mean that it couldn't be a good site for forest farming, because a lot of these places are pretty degraded. They're beat up. If they're in the middle of a farm, who knows what's been happening there. And so if you take out the invasives and plant some test plots, the plants themselves will tell you if you're listening. So just, this is maybe the one slide that I recycled from last year. You can see this ginseng, 75 to 90% shade is where it would probably be happy. False unicorn root, people think it's this deep forest herb. It grows, on the edge of a road, it'll grow out in a clearing. And, the soil pH, we talked about that a little bit, ginseng. It's not a circumneutral soil that thing necessarily likes, even though it likes a lot of calcium. Compare that to false unicorn root. You'll find that growing in more acidic soils, and so it's just something to think about. Like I wouldn't necessarily put lime on false unicorn root patch, but I might on ginseng, Okay, I hope I left enough time for more questions and discussion. Thank you.
So this is just a point that was on a slide that you didn't vocally touch on, but it read that bush honeysuckle is allelopathic.
It sure is.
Could you speak more about that and what the mechanism is there?
Well, people think these things are always from leaves falling off the trees. That's true, but the main mechanism, as Shabu Jose talked about in black walnut, is actually root exudates. And so if you go and compare the Land of the Osages site to the Horticulture and Agroforestry Research Farm, where I replicated a trial, I would have thought that the plots at Harf were going to do better. They had more soil moisture. They had every advantage, nicer soil texture. But because it's like on the edge of a ridge top that's been farmed heavily in the past, there's a lot of bush honeysuckle. And the plots that I put in there used to be a research site for morel mushrooms. All these honeysuckle move in from somebody planting them in Miami University in Oxford 40 years ago. And the plants are still there where we planted them, but they haven't seeded themselves out. At Land of the Osages, where last time I was there, there's not a lot of the bush honeysuckle. The stone root is all over the place. There's, in 2019 when I last visited, there's 5 times as much stone root as I planted, and it's like, wow, I didn't even have to pick up the seed and plant it. It just spread itself around. And I hear the other herbs are doing quite well and starting to spread. And that's not like a diss on land management at Harf. It was a problem when we got there, and it's going to be a problem. I think the thing to remember is if you get a forest management plan and do EQIP and stuff, which is pretty typical for, they're always going to say control the invasives. Well, take 2 years at the beginning, control it, and I'm not trying to push herbicide on anybody, but if you want to be an organically certified farm, there's a 3-year transition period where you can't use herbicide. If you're going to use herbicide, use it judiciously, use it in the beginning, and then from then on, you can hand weed or regular prescribed fire will keep those things tamped down. And we can talk about mechanical management of those things, talk about my thoughts on how to do herbicide in a way that's less harmful. But yeah, that to your point about the allelopathy, I'm just like, I know these things have been making seed, but I do not see any seedlings. I think that's what it is. And it's the same plant that snuffed out all the morels, which left me the site available for me to plant in the first place. Of course, some people are like, oh, morels love bush honeysuckle. Hasn't been my experience.
Thank you.
So I had a question about planting the plugs. This is the first time I've heard of planting these species in like plug form. And I saw the black cohosh in your picture was like actively growing. And I'm used to hearing like you plant them when they're dormant. So are you actually planting plugs like while the plant is actively growing? And like, is there a different time scale for working with that material?
I would plant generally because I have many irons in the fire when the plugs are dormant. However, if we were in Ohio, there's this fellow, he lives in Urbana, and he, like some native species growers, he's got like a drill with an auger on it, and he just makes a little hole, pops a plug in that's the same size, much like our little tool for inoculating the mushroom logs is fitted to the drill bit size, and that works great. He gets a lot of stuff in the ground that way. And let's see here. He uses a ditch witch for bed forming for a lot of these things. And so if you have a site that's really ideal and it's going to stay moist and you water it in when you plant them, it is possible to plant them when they're not in dormancy and still get good survival. But if you're going to plant it and then you're going to come back next year and check on it once, I would say dormant is better. Yeah, I've heard of, so I usually just use a standard soil test and look at soil chemistry. I assume usually that the forest floor is going to have enough like if there's trees there, then there's going to be mycorrhizae there. But people do use like the Haney test, which measures like soil respiration. So it sort of senses how much the microbes are breathing, basically. And there's a lot of microbes breathing in there. It should be pretty good. If there's not, then you actually probably do have a problem. If people put a bunch of copper sulfate on it because it used to be an orchard, like an apple orchard, there can be a legacy effect that might tamp down part of the microbial community. People say glyphosate does the same thing through repeated applications. So, yeah, if you want to inoculate, I haven't seen people put like tree inoculum on the seed. Certainly wouldn't be a bad idea. You can get it from like forestry suppliers. Most forest farmers that I've met basically take a little bit of soil or duff from a healthy looking forest and mix it in with the plugs and sort of just let it naturally colonize from there. You have really no control over what species are there, but a diverse mix from a healthy system can kind of, we assume, do a good job. And I think Janine or someone yesterday talked about that anecdotally. I'm trying to remember what it was. There was some transplants. They didn't look great. And then next time they did this little bit of inoculation with healthy topsoil, and the vigor of the second patch that they planted was way higher. So, yeah.
I have a question here. So you have talked about using herbicide at the beginning and then either manual weeding or prescribed fire. So have you had any experience doing it after you have planted these understory plants? How do they take on the fire? There was some discussion yesterday, but is there any practical experience about that?
Yes, I have. So a thing to note about fire is it's how intense and when you do it. So nowadays it's common for the Forest Service, and I think this is progressive of them compared to where they've been, is they will do a lot of like shelter woods for oak regeneration, and there's usually, they want at least 2, hopefully 3 burns over the course of 10 to 15 years. The Bros shelter wood method. And they might burn in April or May even, because part of what they're going for is hurting all of the tree seedlings, knowing that the oaks and hickories, and if we had chestnuts, American chestnuts, have more shoot buds on the bottom side of their root system. So even if you burn hot, they're better able to bounce back than the like red maples that they're trying to kill. And so they're sort of repeatedly burning after the red maple and everything is leafed out. But if you are doing that kind of burning when all of your herbs are already up, guess what? That you might not kill that plant, but it's probably not going to make seed that year. And you have a bunch of herpetologists mad at you for killing salamanders and box turtles. So the ecologists in the Ozarks that I've worked with, the fire ecologists like Dan Dries and Claire and Susan, they would say, hey, let's not burn after February 15th. I've seen at Ozark National Scenic Riverways the effects of burning in May. And you've got all these bloodroot that are like tiny, and you're like, oh, buddy, I'm sorry. That must have hurt. And then, the ecologists would probably take it further, as long as it's not like on steep site, it's relatively flat. They might tell you to burn in the fall, actually, after leaf drop. And that's, fire science is kind of a deep thing. But if you can at least do it before your herbs leaf out, I think you'll get success. And granted, as Carter will tell you, getting a good day to burn in the winter or early spring can be challenging. So if you want to use prescribed fire instead of herbicide, it probably means like having your lines in the fall, and then prepping any snags, removing the leaf litter from around the base of dead trees so they don't go up when you burn. So there's some preparation ahead of time that will allow you to be relatively stress free the day of the burn. You're not running around and having to call all your friends to, do the work the day before. That's certainly never happened to me. I'm just, hypothetically. Thank you very much.